It started in the most innocuous way. I was sitting on a worn leather couch, the smell of lavender lingering faintly in the air, as Dr. Nolan scribbled something into his notepad. His office was calm, the kind of space designed to put people at ease, but my mind was anything but. I feel disconnected, I said, breaking the silence. From everything. From my husband, from myself. Like I'm just going through the motions. Dr. Nolan looked up, his expression thoughtful but kind. That's a common feeling, he said. But the fact that you're here, talking about it, is the first step to understanding why. At that moment, he seemed like the perfect therapist, attentive, empathetic, and completely professional. Little did I know, that image would soon unravel, and so would my life. When I first started therapy, I was hesitant to open up. My marriage with Mark wasn't bad, per se, but it wasn't good either. We drifted apart over the years, the spark that once defined our relationship now a faint flicker buried beneath the weight of routines and unspoken frustrations. Dr. Nolan became a lifeline. In those weekly sessions, I found a space where I could say all the things I was too scared to say out loud anywhere else. I feel invisible, I admitted one afternoon, tears threatening to spill. Mark doesn't see me anymore. Or maybe I don't see myself. Dr. Nolan's voice was steady and reassuring. Sometimes we lose sight of ourselves when we're too focused on others, he said. It's not about blame. It's about figuring out what you need to feel whole again. His words felt like a balm, and over time, I began to rely on him not just as a therapist, but as a source of validation and understanding. Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment things began to change. It was a rainy Thursday, and I'd arrived at my session soaked from head to toe after forgetting my umbrella. You look like you've had a day, Dr. Nolan said, offering me a tissue for my dripping face. I laughed, a little embarrassed. It's been one of those weeks. He smiled, and for the first time, I noticed how warm his eyes were, how his presence made me feel lighter. That night, as I lay in bed beside Mark, I couldn't stop replaying the interaction in my mind. It wasn't anything overtly inappropriate, but it felt significant. Over the next few sessions, the dynamic between Dr. Nolan and me began to shift in ways I couldn't quite articulate. He started sharing small details about his own life, a book he was reading, a favorite coffee shop he recommended. It felt harmless at first, like he was trying to make me comfortable. But then, there were the compliments. Subtle at first, "You're very insightful," or "You have a way of seeing things that's rare," but they grew bolder over time. "You're a remarkable person," he said one day, his voice low. "You don't give yourself enough credit." The words lit a spark in me that I hadn't felt in years. The moment it happened, I knew I'd made a mistake I couldn't undo. After a particularly emotional session, Dr. Nolan walked me to the door as usual. But instead of the customary goodbye, there was a hesitation, a pause in which the air seemed to thicken. "Take care of yourself," he said softly, his hand brushing mine. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. The kiss was brief but electric, a jolt that sent my heart racing and my mind spiraling. "I'm sorry," I stammered, pulling away. But Dr. Nolan didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm. "We can talk about this." That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, confusion, and something else I didn't want to name. Mark was oblivious, his steady breathing beside me a reminder of the life I was jeopardizing. I told myself it was a one-time lapse, a moment of weakness that didn't have to mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next session, Dr. Nolan and I pretended nothing had happened. We danced around the subject, sticking to safe topics and avoiding eye contact for longer than necessary. But the tension was unbearable, and it wasn't long before the boundary was crossed again. What started as a single kiss spiraled into something I couldn't control. Dr. Nolan and I began meeting outside of sessions, our interactions no longer confined to the professional veneer of his office. I told myself it was harmless, that I deserved to feel seen and valued, even if it was in the wrong place. But with every meeting, every stolen moment, the weight of what I was doing grew heavier. Mark started noticing the change in me. "You seem distracted lately," he said one evening as we ate dinner. "Just work stuff," I lied, forcing a smile. The lies came easier than I expected, but they left a bitter taste in my mouth. The turning point came when Dr. Nolan brought up the future. "What are we doing here?" I asked during one of our secret meetings, my voice trembling. "This, whatever this is, it's wrong." "I know," he said, his expression pained. "But I can't stop thinking about you." His words were like a double-edged sword, cutting through the guilt while simultaneously feeding the part of me that craved his attention. "I can't keep lying to Mark," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You don't have to decide anything right now," Dr. Nolan said, his hand brushing mine. "Just take it one step at a time." As I left that meeting, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could keep pretending that everything was fine, burying the truth beneath layers of deceit. Or I could face the fallout of my actions and try to salvage what was left of my life. But the question that haunted me wasn't what to do, it was whether I deserved to move forward at all. The weeks that followed were some of the most emotionally fraught of my life. Every day felt like a tightrope walk, balancing the fragile illusion of normalcy with the storm of guilt and confusion that raged inside me. Mark, ever perceptive, started asking more questions. "You've been spending a lot of time at those therapy sessions," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "They're helping," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "It's just taking longer than I thought to work through everything." He nodded, his expression thoughtful but concerned. "I just want you to be happy." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Carrying the secret of my affair with Dr. Nolan felt like holding a ticking time bomb. Every interaction with Mark was tinged with an unbearable tension, every glance from him a reminder of the trust one was betraying. At the same time, my feelings for Dr. Nolan were a tangled web of infatuation, dependence, and fear. He'd become both a source of comfort and a constant reminder of my guilt. "What are we doing?" I asked him one afternoon during one of our clandestine meetings. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. But I don't want to lose you." His words should have reassured me, but instead, they filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. As the weeks turned into months, Mark's patience began to wear thin. He started noticing the inconsistencies in my stories, the way I always seemed to avoid talking about therapy in detail. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, he turned to me with a serious expression. "Caroline, is there something you're not telling me?" The question froze me in place. My heart pounded as I forced a smile. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, his tone uncertain. "You've just seemed different lately." I laughed nervously, brushing off his concern. "It's just the therapy," I said. "It's bringing up a lot of emotions." He nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. The weight of my secret became unbearable during one particular session with Dr. Nolan. I arrived at his office feeling on edge, my nerves frayed from weeks of sleepless nights and endless guilt. "I can't do this anymore," I blurted out as soon as I sat down. Dr. Nolan looked at me, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Us," I said, gesturing between us. "It's wrong. And it's destroying me." He leaned forward, his expression softening. "Caroline, I know this is hard. But we found something here, something real." His words, meant to comfort, only made me feel more trapped. "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not real. It's a mistake. And I need to fix it before it ruins everything." That evening, I made a decision I'd been avoiding for months. I sat down with Mark and forced myself to speak the words I'd been too afraid to say. "There's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice trembling. Mark's face darkened, his usual calm replaced with a mix of confusion and fear. What is it? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I've been seeing someone. Outside of therapy. His expression shifted, the weight of my confession sinking in. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears streamed down my face as I told him the truth, about Dr. Nolan, about the affair, about the lies I'd been living. Mark's reaction was everything I'd feared and more. Anger, betrayal, and heartbreak flashed across his face as he struggled to process what I'd told him. How could you do this? He asked, his voice breaking. I trusted you. I thought we were in this together. I'm sorry, I said, my voice choked with sobs. I didn't mean for it to happen. I felt so lost. That doesn't make it okay, he said, standing up and pacing the room. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed us. The days that followed were a blur of tears and tense conversations. Mark moved into the guest room, leaving our shared bedroom a hollow, painful reminder of what we'd lost. At the same time, I ended things with Dr. Nolan, cutting off all contact and reporting him to the licensing board for his unethical behavior. It was a step toward accountability, but it didn't erase the damage I'd done. In therapy, this time with a new, impartial counselor, I began to unpack the choices that had led me to this point. I realized that my affair with Dr. Nolan wasn't just about him, it was about me. About the void I'd been trying to fill, the pain I'd been too afraid to confront. The process was painful, but it was also necessary. For the first time in months, I felt like I was starting to understand myself, and what I needed to do to move forward. Mark and I weren't ready to give up on our marriage, but rebuilding trust proved to be the hardest thing either of us had ever done. Through countless therapy sessions, tearful conversations, and moments of doubt, we began to take small steps toward healing. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Mark said one evening, his voice heavy with emotion. But I want to try. That's all I can ask for, I replied. The aftermath of my confession felt like living in the eye of a storm, calm on the surface, but with chaos swirling just beneath. Mark and I were still under the same roof, but everything between us had changed. Conversations were short and strained, and the silences in our home grew longer and heavier. For weeks, we tiptoed around each other, each trying to process what had happened in our own way. It felt impossible to bridge the distance between us, yet neither of us had the strength to walk away entirely. After the initial shock subsided, we decided to seek help. Together, we started couples therapy, this time with a licensed therapist who specialized in rebuilding relationships after infidelity. Dr. Patel was calm and composed, her demeanor steady even when our emotions boiled over during sessions. Trust isn't something that's given, she said during our first session. It's something that's earned. Rebuilding it will take time, effort, and honesty, from both of you. Mark's response was cautious. I don't know if I can trust her again, he said, his voice raw. And that's okay, Dr. Patel said gently. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. But if you're both committed to this process, it's possible to find a new path forward. One of the hardest parts of therapy was confronting the pain we'd both been carrying. For Mark, it was the betrayal, the realization that I had turned to someone else instead of working through our struggles together. For me, it was the shame. Admitting what I'd done and facing the consequences of my actions felt like peeling back layers of my own skin, exposing wounds I hadn't even realized were there. I don't understand how you could do this, Mark said during one session, his voice trembling. How could you let it get that far? I don't know, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I felt so invisible, so lost. And Dr. Nolan, he made me feel seen. But it was wrong, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Mark nodded, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. It feels like I don't even know you anymore, he said. I'm still me, I said softly. But I know I need to change. Despite the pain, there were small moments that gave me hope. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, Mark handed me a cup of tea without a word. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline, a sign that he was still willing to try. Another time, during therapy, Mark admitted, "I don't want this to be the end. I just don't know how to move forward." His vulnerability reminded me of the man I fell in love with, the man I'd hurt so deeply but still hoped to rebuild a life with. Rebuilding trust was the hardest part. Mark needed reassurance, and I had to learn how to provide it without defensiveness or frustration. "I need to know where you are," he said one day, his voice firm but not angry. "Of course," I replied. "I'll share my schedule, and if you ever need to talk, just call me." It felt strange at first, like my every move was under a microscope. But I understood that transparency was the price of rebuilding what I'd broken. Over time, those measures became less about control and more about communication, proof that I was willing to put in the work to earn his trust again. As the months passed, we started to rediscover each other in small ways. We took walks in the evenings, talking about things we hadn't shared in years, our fears, our hopes, the memories that had shaped us. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark said, "I miss the way we used to be." "Me too," I said. "But maybe we can be something better now." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe." A turning point came when I received an email from the licensing board investigating Dr. Nolan. He had lost his license, a consequence of his unethical behavior. The news brought a mix of emotions, relief that he was being held accountable, but also a lingering sense of guilt for my role in the situation. When I told Mark about the email, he was quiet for a long time. "I'm glad he's out of your life," he said finally. "But this isn't just about him. It's about us." He was right. The past was behind us, but the work of rebuilding our future was far from over. By the time we reached the 6-month mark in therapy, things between us had started to shift. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as raw. We'd begun to laugh again, to find moments of connection that reminded us of why we'd fought so hard to stay together. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, a tradition we'd started in therapy, Mark turned to me and said, "I think we're going to be okay." His words brought tears to my eyes. "I hope so," I said. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I know we will." Our journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on solid ground. We weren't the same couple we'd been before, but in some ways, that was a good thing. We'd learned how to communicate, how to be honest about our needs, and how to rebuild trust one day at a time. As we looked toward the future, I felt a sense of hope, not just for our marriage, but for the person I was becoming. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment or a switch that flipped. It was a process, one that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to face the pain head-on. For Mark and me, forgiveness became the cornerstone of our healing journey, but it was anything but easy. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old sitcom we both loved, Mark laughed at a joke that sent us both into a fit of giggles. For the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the man he'd been before everything fell apart, light-hearted, unburdened. When the laughter subsided, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "I miss this," he said quietly. "I miss us." "Me too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a sign that the walls between us were beginning to crack. In therapy, Dr. Patel encouraged us to dig deeper into the root causes of what had happened. "Forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring the past," she said. "It means understanding it and choosing to move forward despite the hurt." For Mark, this meant asking questions that were painful but necessary. "Did you ever think about what this would do to me?" he asked during one session, his voice trembling. I didn't let myself think about it, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "I was so wrapped up in my own pain that I didn't stop to consider yours. And I'm so sorry for that." Hearing his questions was hard, but answering them was even harder. Still, each honest conversation felt like a step toward rebuilding the trust we'd lost. Physical and emotional intimacy had been casualties of the affair, and rebuilding them required time and effort. At first, even simple gestures like holding hands felt loaded with tension. But slowly, we began to reconnect in small ways: a touch on the shoulder, a kiss goodnight, a hug that lingered a little longer than usual. One night, as we were sitting together on the porch, Mark reached for my hand. "I want us to get back to a place where this feels natural again," he said. "So do I," I replied, squeezing his hand. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. While Mark worked on forgiving me, I struggled with forgiving myself. The shame of what I'd done was a constant presence, a shadow that followed me everywhere. "You can't change the past," Dr. Patel said during one of my individual sessions. "But you can learn from it." Self-forgiveness doesn't mean excusing your actions, it means acknowledging them and committing to doing better. Her words resonated with me, and I began to approach my guilt with more compassion. I couldn't undo the hurt I'd caused, but I could take responsibility for it and work toward becoming the person I wanted to be. As part of our healing process, Mark and I started a weekly tradition of check-ins. Every Sunday evening, we'd sit down together and talk openly about how we were feeling, about our relationship, our individual lives, and the progress we were making. At first, these conversations were awkward and emotionally charged. But over time, they became a safe space for us to express our fears, hopes, and gratitude. "I appreciate how hard you're working on this," Mark said during one check-in. "I know it's not easy." "Neither is forgiving me," I replied. "But I'm so grateful that you're trying." One of the ways we rebuilt our connection was by focusing on shared goals. We decided to take a weekend trip to a nearby town, a small step toward rediscovering the joy of spending time together outside of the heavy context of our healing journey. The trip was simple but meaningful. We explored local shops, tried new foods, and laughed at the absurdity of getting lost on a hiking trail. As we drove home, Mark turned to me and said, "This feels like a fresh start." "It does," I agreed, my heart swelling with hope. One of the most profound moments of forgiveness came during an unexpected conversation. I'd accidentally spilled coffee on a stack of Mark's work papers, and as I scrambled to clean up the mess, I blurted out, "I'm sorry, I keep messing everything up." Mark paused, then placed his hand on mine. "Caroline, you're not the same person who made those mistakes," he said. "You're trying, and that's what matters." His words felt like a balm, a reminder that forgiveness wasn't just something he said, it was something he practiced. As we approached the one-year mark of my confession, Mark and I began to reflect on how far we'd come. The pain wasn't gone, but it no longer consumed us. In its place was a newfound resilience and a deeper understanding of what it meant to love and be loved. "I never thought we'd get here," Mark said one evening as we sat on the couch, sharing a blanket and a bowl of popcorn. "Neither did I admitted. But I'm so glad we didn't give up." "Me too," he said, his voice steady. "I think we're stronger now, not because of what happened, but because of how we've faced it. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it gave us the strength to build a future. We weren't the same couple we'd been before the affair, but in many ways, that was a good thing. We'd learned how to communicate, how to support each other, and how to navigate the complexities of love and trust." As we looked toward the future, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Mark's forgiveness, but for the lessons we'd learned along the way. By the time we reached the one-year anniversary of my confession, the wounds in our relationship had started to heal. They hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt fresh and raw. Instead, they had become scars, visible reminders of our past, but no longer defining us. Mark and I were in a better place, but we both knew that staying there would take effort. Rebuilding our relationship hadn't been easy, and maintaining it required just as much care and commitment. Our Sunday evening check-ins had become a cornerstone of our relationship. What started as a structured exercise from therapy had evolved into something more, a space where we could connect, reflect, and communicate openly. One Sunday, As we sat across from each other at the kitchen table, Mark surprised me with a question. "What's one thing I can do better?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I don't know," I said. "You've been so patient with me. I don't feel like I can ask for more." He shook his head. "That's not what this is about. I want to make sure I'm not getting complacent. We've come too far to let that happen." His willingness to grow reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Life didn't stop presenting challenges just because we were in a better place. Work stress, family obligations, and the everyday pressures of life all had the potential to create friction. One evening, after a particularly stressful week, we found ourselves arguing over something trivial, whose turn it was to do the laundry. "I'm not a mind reader, Mark," I snapped. "If you need help, just say so." "And I'm not a robot, Caroline," he shot back. "I can't do everything." The argument escalated quickly, leaving us both frustrated and hurt. But instead of letting it fester, we revisited the conversation during our next check-in. "I shouldn't have snapped at you," I admitted. "I was tired, but that's not an excuse." "I could have communicated better too," Mark said. "Let's figure out a way to divide things more evenly." The resolution wasn't perfect, but it was progress, a reminder that we could face conflicts without letting them derail us. Amid the work of maintaining our relationship, Mark and I also made a conscious effort to rediscover joy together. We started planning monthly adventure days, where we'd try something new, whether it was taking a cooking class, going paddleboarding, or exploring a nearby town. One weekend, we decided to tackle a DIY project, building a garden in our backyard. It was messy, chaotic, and full of moments where we questioned our decision, but by the end of the weekend, we had a small but thriving patch of green. "It's not perfect," Mark said as we surveyed our handiwork. "Neither are we," I replied, smiling. "But it's ours." As we settled into our new rhythm, Mark and I also began focusing on our individual growth. For me, that meant continuing therapy and exploring hobbies I'd neglected for years, like painting and writing. For Mark, it meant pursuing a professional certification he'd always talked about but never had the time for. "I'm proud of you," I told him one evening as he studied for an exam. "Thanks," he said, looking up from his notes. "I couldn't do this without you." His words reminded me of how far we'd come, not just as a couple, but as individuals who supported each other's dreams. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mark turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'd be here if none of this had happened?" he asked. I thought about his question for a moment before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I do know that what we've built now feels stronger than what we had before." "Me too," he said, reaching for my hand. The conversation wasn't about justifying the past, it was about acknowledging the growth that had come from it. As we planned for the future, we talked about the things that mattered most to us: traveling, spending more time with family, and continuing to prioritize our relationship. "We've done a lot of rebuilding," Mark said during one of our check-ins. "Now I think it's time to start building something new." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. "I mean setting new goals together," he said. "Like planning a big trip, or maybe even thinking about starting a family." His words filled me with a mix of excitement and apprehension, but mostly, they filled me with hope. On the anniversary of our first therapy session, Mark surprised me with a small celebration, a homemade dinner and a handwritten letter. In the letter, he wrote, "Caroline, this past year has been the hardest of my life, but also the most meaningful. Thank you for your honesty, your commitment, and your willingness to fight for us. I'm proud of how far we've come, and I'm excited for everything that's still ahead." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized that for all the pain we'd endured, we'd also found something beautiful, a relationship built on resilience, honesty, and love. As we moved into the second year of rebuilding our relationship, the focus shifted from mending the cracks to strengthening the foundation. We were no longer in survival mode. Instead, we were thriving, learning to live with the scars of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. Mark and I had discovered a new rhythm, one that felt more intentional, more attuned to each other's needs, and more resilient. The pain of what had happened wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something that shaped us rather than defined us. One of the ways we continued to grow was by setting new goals for ourselves, both individually and as a couple. During one of our Sunday check-ins, we started brainstorming a list of things we wanted to achieve together. "Let's do something big," Mark said, his eyes lighting up. "Something that scares us a little." "Like what?" I asked, intrigued. "Maybe a cross-country road trip," he suggested. "Or skydiving." I laughed, shaking my head. "You can keep the skydiving. But a road trip sounds fun." The idea sparked a series of plans, mapping out potential routes, researching destinations, and imagining the memories we'd create along the way. As we planned our trip, I noticed how much stronger our sense of partnership had become. Mark and I were no longer navigating life as two separate individuals who happened to be married. We were a team, tackling challenges and pursuing dreams together. One evening, as we finalized the itinerary for our road trip, Mark turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I don't think we could have done this a year ago," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, I don't think we were this connected before," he said. "This feels different. Better." I nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. "It does," I agreed. The road trip turned out to be everything we hoped for and more. Over the course of 2 weeks, we explored breathtaking landscapes, tried new foods, and reconnected with a sense of adventure we hadn't felt in years. One night, as we sat under a canopy of stars in a remote campsite, Mark reached for my hand. "This is what life should feel like," he said. "Freezing cold and slightly terrifying." I teased, gesturing to the howling wind. He laughed, pulling me closer. "No. It should feel like this, full of possibilities." As we returned home from the trip, Mark and I began talking about what kind of legacy we wanted to build together. "I want us to have something that's uniquely ours," Mark said one evening as we shared a bottle of wine on the porch. "Like what?" I asked. "Maybe a family," he said. "Or a project we can work on together, something that makes a difference." The idea of starting a family had always been a distant thought, but now, it felt like a natural next step in our journey. We didn't rush into any decisions, but we agreed to explore the possibility with open hearts. One of the lessons we'd learned during our journey was the importance of gratitude. Instead of taking each other for granted, we made a conscious effort to express appreciation for the small, everyday moments. "I love how you always make me laugh, even when I'm in a terrible mood," I told Mark one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "And I love how you never let me give up," he replied. Those moments of acknowledgement became anchors in our relationship, reminding us of the love and respect we shared. Of course, no relationship is without its challenges, and ours was no exception. There were still moments of doubt and insecurity, especially when reminders of the past surfaced unexpectedly. One evening, while sorting through old documents, I came across a letter I'd written during the affair, a letter I'd intended to give to Dr. Nolan but never sent. The sight of it sent a wave of shame crashing over me, but instead of hiding it, I brought it to Mark. "What's this?" he asked, scanning the page. "Something I wrote during everything," I said. "I thought you should see it." He read the letter silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for showing me this." His response wasn't angry or accusatory, it was calm, understanding. And in that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. As we approached our second anniversary of rebuilding, Mark and I decided to celebrate by revisiting some of our favorite memories from the past 2 years. We recreated the first meal we cooked together during therapy, revisited the hiking trail where we'd gotten lost, and even rewatched the sitcom that had made us laugh on one of our hardest nights. "This feels like a new chapter," Mark said as we sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset. It does, I agreed. And I'm excited to see where it takes us. Looking back, I realized that our relationship hadn't just been repaired, it had been reborn. The foundation we'd built was stronger than the one we'd started with, rooted in honesty, resilience, and a shared commitment to growth. Mark and I weren't the same people we'd been before, but in many ways, that was a good thing. We'd learned how to navigate challenges, communicate openly, and prioritize what truly mattered. As we looked toward the future, I felt a deep sense of hope, not just for our relationship, but for the life we were creating together. As we moved forward in our relationship, Mark and I found ourselves standing on the edge of a new chapter. The past no longer felt like a weight holding us back, it was a part of our story, but not the whole story. What defined us now was the life we were building together, one filled with love, purpose, and the resilience we had earned through our struggles. The lessons we'd learned along the way weren't just about healing, they were about how to live fully, with intention and gratitude. One evening, as we sat in the backyard surrounded by the glow of string lights, Mark turned to me with a question. "What do you want our life to look like in 5 years?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, but it also filled me with excitement. "I want us to keep growing," I said. "As individuals and as a couple. And I want us to create something that feels uniquely ours." Mark nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I want that too. I think we're ready to start thinking about what that means." That conversation sparked a series of deeper discussions about our dreams and aspirations. We talked about starting a family, traveling to places we'd always dreamed of visiting, and even the idea of starting a small business together, something creative and fulfilling that would allow us to work as a team. The decision to start a family was one we didn't take lightly. After months of conversations and reflection, we decided to try. It was a leap of faith, but one that felt right. The process wasn't without its challenges, but it brought us even closer together. Every doctor's visit, every late-night conversation about parenting, and every hope we shared for the future felt like another thread weaving us together. When we finally got the news that we were expecting, the joy was overwhelming. Mark held me tightly, his eyes shining with tears. "We're really doing this," he said, his voice filled with wonder. As we prepared for the arrival of our child, Mark and I started creating new traditions that would carry us into this next phase of our lives. We turned Sunday check-ins into family planning sessions, brainstorming everything from baby names to nursery designs. We also began writing letters to our future child, a practice that felt deeply personal and meaningful. In those letters, we shared our hopes, our lessons, and our commitment to building a loving and supportive home. As we prepared for this new chapter, Mark and I often found ourselves reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked one night as we sat in the nursery, assembling a crib. "All the time," I said. "I can't believe how much we've been through, and how much we've grown because of it." He smiled, his hand resting on mine. "I wouldn't change a thing," he said. His words brought tears to my eyes. For all the pain and hardship we'd endured, we had emerged stronger, more connected, and more ready than ever to face whatever came next. When our child was born, it felt like the culmination of everything we'd worked for. Holding that tiny, perfect being in our arms, Mark and I felt a sense of purpose and love that transcended anything we'd ever known. "We're a family," Mark said softly, his voice filled with awe. "We always have been," I replied, smiling through tears. The arrival of our child didn't erase the past, but it marked a new beginning, one that was rooted in the lessons we'd learned and the love we'd chosen to nurture. As we settled into life as parents, Mark and I continued to prioritize our relationship. We knew that the strength of our bond was the foundation of everything we wanted to build for our family. We celebrated the small moments, late-night feedings, first smiles, and quiet evenings spent together as a family. And we continued to dream, always looking ahead to the possibilities that lay before us. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset with our child asleep inside, Mark turned to me with a smile. "Do you think we've finally made it?" he asked. I thought about his question, about the journey we'd taken and the life we'd built. "I don't think it's about making it," I said. "I think it's about continuing to grow, together." He nodded, taking my hand. "Here's to the next chapter," he said. "To the next chapter," I echoed, feeling a deep sense of peace and gratitude. Mark and I weren't perfect, and our life wasn't without its challenges. But what mattered most was that we faced those challenges together, with love, resilience, and a commitment to building a life we could be proud of. As I looked at the life we'd created, a life filled with laughter, connection, and purpose, I knew that the journey was far from over. But for the first time, I felt ready for whatever came next. Together, we had built something beautiful. And together, we would continue to grow.